Our final discussion of the US Constitution is actually a consideration of the California Constitution. The California State Legislature has decided that as part of its mission, California State University, regardless of which campus you go to, that you will need to take this class, a class that covers the national political institutions, but will also discuss the California. And so in this course in California, in each of the chapters, rather than just doing a separate lecture on California, we're going to be doing it throughout the course. And so this is our first time to be doing it. It's actually the second time. We've already talked about the fact that California has a system of direct democracy. The United States government does not. And so we'll continue that throughout the course when the California system is very similar to or very different from the US. And as I say on the first slide, and the first substantive slide, is that we can use the power of comparison. I actually study comparative politics and think that the power of comparison in social science is very powerful and is very useful. And so we're going to be using that as a way to focus our understanding, because there's a lot to know about the California political system, and to add that into a discussion of already the United States system, it would be relatively difficult. So one way of doing it is to use what we know of the American Constitution and think about how the California Constitution is very similar to or different from it. And so that's what we'll be doing. And we'll be doing that particularly with an emphasis on the Declaration of Rights. The Declaration of Rights is, in the California Constitution, very similar to the Bill of Rights that we have for the US Constitution. So we're going to be talking about that and what sort of rights are protected there and what those mean. We're also going to be discussing the fact that the California Constitution is one of the longest constitutions in the world, whereas the US has a fairly short constitution. I can actually assign you to read the US Constitution, and I am not going to subject you to reading the California Constitution because it is, again, one of the longest constitutions in the world. Depending on how you rank it, it's certainly in the top 10, but it may be number 2 or 3 or 4, depending on how you rank those things. And we want to talk about why that is. And a lot of that has to do with the very different amendment process that you have available in the California Constitution that's not available in the US Constitution. And finally, we're going to talk about, again, and really think a little bit more about this, the fact that California has direct democracy. It also has indirect democracy, but it has direct democracy, whereas the United States does not. Okay, so the first one is a discussion of the idea of the Declaration of Rights. Came into force in the 19th century, and it's not plagiarism for California or other states to use the Bill of Rights as a way of coming up with a list of what sort of individual freedom. And the California Constitution includes many of the same rights that the US Constitution protects. And as we'll talk about, this is necessary because under our system of federalism, the Bill of Rights restricts the national government from infringing liberties, but the state governments could restrict a lot of those individual freedoms. Now, there was a process whereby the U.S. Supreme Court, 15th Amendment to the U.S. Constitution, once that was ratified, to take parts of the Bill of Rights and apply them directly to the states. But that was a process that took about 100 years, and so state governments could and did put in provisions in their own state constitutions to say these individual liberties would be protected from the state governments infringing on those. And California has a number of those. So freedom of speech and assembly and petition and all of those good things are protected in the California Constitution, just as they are protected in the US Constitution. But there are also in the California Constitution some things that people might find a little less important. We'll just start with this, is the right to fish on public land is in Article 1, Section 25 of the California Constitution. Now, for those of you who love fishing, maybe this is a great thing to be able to do, to take your fishing pole and be able to go anywhere on public lands in California and do some fishing. But people, even if you like fishing, might be open to the argument that it might not be to the level of protection against cruel and unusual punishment or freedom of speech or some of the other rights. And so some argue that the inclusion of those things indicates perhaps not a lack of seriousness. I don't think they're talking about that. Changing what this Declaration of Rights is going to mean. Whereas in the US Constitution is meant to protect these we have. Whereas the California Constitution is starting to follow down the process that Alexander Hamilton suggested would happen. If you need to list all these individual freedoms, you might be spending quite a bit of time because someone will bring up, they're like, wait, it's not possible for us to fish on public land, we need to include that. But more than that, there are some controversial rights that are actually protected in the California Constitution. So one is the victims' rights and restitution. In Article 1, Section 28 of the California Constitution, it says that people who are victims of crimes or family members who have had a family member murdered, they can also uh, seek restitution who has committed the crime. And so many argue that that's an important thing. People who believe in victims' rights argues that it's an important thing to have. They were in the California Constitution, but some argue it actually influences the judicial system in an important way. We can see this play an important case that we know of O.J. Simpson. O.J. Simpson was found not guilty in a criminal sense, but at the same time, he was found liable in a civil sense. And the family of his victims, although not criminally prosecuted, not criminally sentenced because of that, or found guilty of those things, O.J. Simpson was responsible for paying money to the family members of his victims. I argue that this is in part why California has such a large population in their prisons, and we spend more money on our prisons than we do on our higher education system here in California, in part because having such strong victims' rights means that we are a state that is tough on crime. But it is, at least everyone agrees that that is something, that the idea of having the right to seek civil damages is maybe important, but this is changing what should be a criminal thing and what the state should be responsible for and turn it into a much larger and more controversial decision. Another one is that in the California Constitution, as in Article 1, Section 28, is that there's a requirement to have safe schools, that there need to be safe, secure, and peaceful schools. And again, that's a great thing to have. There's nothing wrong with that necessarily, but it is also something that might set a standard that can't actually be reached. So if you have listed in the Constitution something that you know when you're writing it, you can't actually fulfill those things. It changes the nature of the Constitution. It changes what a Constitution means by including provisions that are aspirations. As we talked about, some people argue that democracy should be seen as an aspiration, but it is a system of government that actually has to work in the world that exists and the difficult challenges that exist there. And so if you include constitutional provisions that you know will not be secured entirely, doesn't that perhaps indicate that there are other parts of the Constitution, the California Constitution, you might not need to support in a similar sort of way? That the California Constitution has a different viewpoint in terms of what a constitution is, what a constitution means, and how a constitution should work. And again, I don't need you to agree or disagree with whether or not you think we should have this part of the Constitution or not. Instead, it's for us to think about the larger issue. If you include on your Constitution or in your Constitution some rights that may not be fulfilled entirely, then you might think about a change to how the Constitution should be viewed.